Good morning and welcome to this week's episode of the Space Times Podcast. I am Paul Mayer, and with me, as always, is Harrison Lambert. This week, we've got some big updates in the theaters of space domain awareness and launch. Additionally, there's some movement in the space communications and space habitats industries, and we're excited to explore them and discuss what those headlines and findings might be. Let's dive right in.
All right, so this week we've had some big moves in space domain awareness. This topic's come up previously, but this week seems to have some major movement across multiple nations, across multiple countries. One of the biggest demonstrations of that international cooperation is a demonstration of the DARC, which is the Deep Space Advanced Radar Capability. This is an international cooperation between the US, UK, and Australia to develop a radar network to track GEO satellites in orbit. We've heard previously from the likes of the US Space Force Command about the lack of space tracking capability and how there's a need for us to improve this. This seems like a very strong capability to improve that. The test this week happened in Australia, where they used a series of a few of their several radar dishes to track a GEO satellite in orbit, proving out its capability and moving us towards rolling this out over the next several years throughout the 3 radar sites in Australia, US, and UK, providing global real-time coverage of all GEO assets, which is great benefit for anybody that's got assets out there in GEO, which does include the likes of the US and UK, particularly with GPS satellites that sit in the higher orbits. There's another contract that came out of Canada for much a similar purpose to do GEO tracking using on-orbit assets. So MDA won this contract to use the Sapphire satellite to also provide GEO tracking. So it's kind of fascinating to see that there's so much effort being placed in tracking of GEOCOM assets when there's a lot of talk about the cluttering of the LEO orbit. So what's your kind of take on this focus?
Yeah, it's interesting that the defense prioritization is on the smaller of the 2 orbit shares by a wide margin. Honestly, my first thought is how impressive it is that AUKUS has already gotten some major legislation and some major contracts signed and rolling away. AUKUS AUKUS is the Australia, UK, US partnership. It's intended to streamline collaboration between the 3 nations as far as it comes to defense and space applications. So ITAR, EAR, a lot of certification, a lot of export licensing, a lot of previous barriers to working with other companies or agencies hosted in those nations have been streamlined and simplified. And so that was signed earlier this year. So I mean, this is light speed for any sort of defense or government agency to sign into effect a new partnership with nations and then act on that partnership. So just off the baseline, this is the AUKUS partnership we're already seeing the benefits and priorities of that start to play out. To your question, I think it's interesting that they're focusing on the GEO asset class, but it does sort of make sense. Primarily, the LEO orbit space is largely commercial, and the GEO orbit space is still largely federal or state owned. So as far as quote unquote military assets or spy satellites or anything to that effect, GEO is going to be much more of a target rich environment for that aspect. So I get the impression that there's a desire and that this DARC capability is intended to track adversarial nations' EO satellites and EO assets, and effectively, to at the very least, know what adversarial states or nations are imaging and get a sense of, well, at least we know what they know.
Yeah, and I think geo makes a lot of sense for defense purposes because the main point of a stationary orbit is you get to sit over one location all the time. And there's not much reason to have global coverage when forces like the U.S. military force aren't involved across the world. There's very particular areas. And usually with geo, we see communications applications, but that's from the commercial side of things. There's possibility to have Earth observation from geo. There's obviously a lot of complications to that, but the U.S. Space Force has a lot of money, and they're very secretive, so it's very possible that there's other applications out there running in the geo orbit. And we're seeing less so. A lot of the conversation about space domain awareness in LEO is about collision avoidance and just trying to avoid cluttering up the LEO orbit so that it can remain accessible for a lot of other companies. With geo, it's starting to look more like they're looking at defensive and offensive capabilities. So a lot of that avoiding having space assets crippled during a wartime effort and preventing any sort of interference from other nations. The same U.S. Space Force has demonstrated, again with UK, the RPO capabilities of some of their spacecraft, undisclosed spacecraft on the USSF side, but some UK geo asset where they're able to get in close proximity and orbit around it to demonstrate that they're able to effectively spy and meet up with a geo asset. They'd done this earlier in the year with France. And actually, after that demonstration, China had done a very similar demonstration of RPO on orbit in the geo domain over the summer. So it seems like there's a real back and forth between these adversarial nations to demonstrate their capability to interfere with operations in geo. So I think these two are kind of going hand in hand, not just because it's the same nations cooperating, but it's two sides of the same coin. It's being able to be aware of what's in geo orbit and being able to actually go and do something about it.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of interest from the Space Force, from Air Force, from Department of Defense in the capability of basically rendezvousing with an on-orbit asset. And often that pitch is for the purpose of refueling. But we also happen to have these welders that we're capable of using. So if we needed to, we could weld through and cut out the solar panels if we need to replace the solar panels, we could do that. Also, if we wanted to just remove the power capabilities of a satellite for whatever reason and put it in timeout, we can do that. Point being that there's already sort of a healthy commercial and entrepreneurial ecosystem around on-orbit servicing, which for the most part commercially is still sort of a slow boat. It's still a long ways out, but the obvious defense implications, the obvious defense use case of finding adversarial assets and rather than servicing, we'll say dis-servicing adversarial assets, that use case is already well aware. And that's something that I think is sort of an unspoken agreement from the efforts demonstrated by DARC and MDA here. I agree with sort of what you're saying. It's interesting to see that MDA is going for space to geo tracking, meaning that their assets are going to be in a lower orbit, sort of tracking up rather than looking around laterally. I'd be curious as to whether or not the business case or use case there closes. The cost of getting the assets up is going to be way higher than using sort of ground station observation or tracking methods. However, anything on the ground, you're going to have a lot more interference. It's going to be harder to more reliably track and observe and keep tabs on these assets. However, to your point, if they're focusing on geo, they're going to be straight ahead. So if it's a rainy day and you can't see it, wait a few hours, you'll be able to see it. It'll be in the same spot.
Yeah.
So interesting to I'm curious to see what the value add of the on-orbital asset to geo orbit observation is. I can think of a myriad of use cases for on orbit to lower orbit, where you're needing to track assets as they orbit and as they come around, and you're needing to potentially keep track of fluctuations or changes in their orbit as they start to as these MEO or LEO assets start to expend fuel and try and alter their orbit, both to actually change their true orbit and to just try and fool tracking efforts by by fluctuating 10% in different directions. But the explicit use case of an orbital low Earth orbit asset to a geo asset observation, that business case seems like a tougher needle to thread. So I'd be interested in learning more about how MDA plans on closing that circle and making that happen.
Yeah, I mean, they're talking about using an existing on-orbit asset, the Sapphire satellite, which is a Canadian radar satellite operated by MDA. So interesting to see that two different agencies, different nations, are taking the same approach to geo-awareness. Radar seems to be the go-to sensor to keep track of satellites. It doesn't give you too much information about the actual interaction between satellites.
I mean, it'll let you know that it's there, but not a lot else.
It'll tell you if a satellite's changing its orbit, which is suspicious on its own, and it'll tell you if two satellites kind of met up in space for some of those rendezvous proximity operations. But it won't tell you if they chopped off a solar array or if they added a listening device or if they did something to your satellite. You know, those kind of capabilities typically have had to be built into the satellite or have had to be done through some sort of on-orbit asset that can rendezvous after the fact to investigate, like a space plane or a space tug. You know, MDA actually, I believe they are still part of Maxar. A couple of years ago, when Maxar displayed their ability to use the Worldview spacecraft to image other spacecraft, but that was from LEO to LEO. So the much closer distances, being able to use the high-res imager to look at other space assets and actually investigate the state of the spacecraft. I think in their demos, they were able to see like destruction from debris on a spacecraft. So a little more detail there, but you know, maybe in the future we'll see some more visible imaging kind of applications to monitoring satellites. But it seems right now these contracts are really focused on just having spatial awareness of where things are and how things are moving around.
I mean, that makes sense. Knowing that they're using the existing on orbit asset, the what was it you said, the Sapphire satellites?
Yeah.
So knowing that they're using the Sapphire asset class that's already on orbit, the immediate questions that come to mind are, well, okay, great. Like, what are the opportunity costs of using that? Is Sapphire no longer doing business? Is this an asset that's already sort of past its expected expiration date, so they're operating on borrowed time at this point? But you know, and the same was true for the Worldview Legion capability demonstration. That, you know, effectively, if you're supposed to be taking pictures of the surface and you pivot or turn to take pictures left or right of something else, like, that's great, but that's a whole lot of time that you're not taking pictures of the surface. So those pictures that you're taking left, right, in the actual space domain itself, they've got to be pretty darn expensive just to break even there. So I'd be interested in better understanding that. But I'm sure MDA still has a whole bunch of smart folks on their team from the time that we were all working together. So I'm sure they know what they're doing. But interesting stuff, to say the least.
Yeah, it looks like Sapphire was a radar satellite launched in 2013 with the purpose of monitoring debris. So this contract really is just an extension of that mission with applications to Canadian Defense Department. So I think it really is reflective of the growing demand for space awareness from all these nation states. You know, having the U.S. partnered with UK and Australia, it makes sense given that UK is no longer part of the EU, and the growing separation between US and EU, and the resulting buildup of Europe's space forces is reflected in other behavior. I mean, if the USSF did a demo with France back in February, this was before this kind of separation of powers has started developing. But
Right.
more in this past week, we saw Germany boost their military spending investment by adding $35 billion into this exact application, into space domain awareness, into offensive and defensive capabilities in orbit. So there's definitely there's a growing demand for this across all nations, and they seem to be doing it independently at different stages in this process. And it's China's doing it, UK union with US is doing it, Europe's doing it, Canada's doing it. They're all sort of a growing demand for this capability.
Yeah. I mean, we spoke last week about both Finland and I believe Japan ramping up and increasing their SAR imaging capability. So this is a domain that we're seeing increased military investment in across the board. But yeah, 35 billion from Germany sets the tone pretty clearly that this is not something that this is not a domain that Europe is willing to cede or fall behind in.
Yeah, but I think the real interesting part is the pressure and the emphasis that the U.S. is putting on this, because it's been a capability that we have, but they seem to be wanting to build it up even more, even though we're so far ahead. It's odd to see that we feel challenged by other nations' capabilities, because if the EU is just now spending money trying to develop this, then the other risk is probably China. If China has been able to do RPO demos right there with us, that must mean that they have orbital capable vehicles that are able to move around in orbit and rendezvous with other spacecraft and do some sort of offensive activity. We've had that capability for a while. The X-37B has been flying for over a decade on the Falcon 9, which is the best launch vehicle available right now. So we should be very far ahead. We've got companies like Sierra Space that are developing their own space plane, and that has in the past been for commercial use or government use, but in the sort of commercial space for the ISS. But just this week, NASA has canceled NASA has revoked their guarantee to purchase further Dream Chaser purchases from Sierra Space. So
well, it's technically not true. I think it's safe for us to say NASA has canceled their contract.
Yeah,
technically not true, but for all sakes and purposes, it's a pretty big blow to the company there.
Yeah, it might come at a pretty good time, honestly. They'll have to pivot, but they've already got $1.43 billion from NASA to develop this space plane, which we already have X-37B, but having multiple options in the U.S. arsenal is great. So I don't see them struggling much to pivot into that defense application, but it is a pretty big loss to have NASA say we're not interested anymore, because that contract in total is worth $14 billion. It's spread across Sierra Space, across Northrop Grumman's Cygnus spacecraft, which actually had a failure on orbit last week. They managed to recover, but they're obviously behind Dragon capsule, which has been flying for years.
Yeah,
it's become very stable.
I mean, it's Sierra is still absolutely going to feel some pains from this. I think the renegotiation of the contract amounts to, I think, a loss over the next 5 to 10 years of 1.7 billion in contract revenue that they were expecting. So to your point, like, this comes at a time where defense and military spending in the domain is rapidly increasing. So there's going to be a whole heck of a lot of demand for them. But at the same time, bird in the hand versus two in the bush, that's a pretty big bird in the hand to lose. So I feel for Sierra Space. I would not be surprised if they had to readjust and furlough some employees or experience some amount of contraction as a result, as they try to sort of pivot and stick the landing. Thankfully for them, Sierra Defense, that got spun up, I want to say in June, didn't it? But they've maybe they saw sort of maybe they had early indicators that this might be coming down the pipeline here, but they've already sort of started building out and focusing on defense applications for their space plane. But yeah, it's been around for a while. I want to say they started in 2008, focusing on crude transportation, and in I want to say 2013, wound up readjusting and focusing on cargo transportation, not crude.
Yeah.
So a huge loss for them, but the capability that they've built out is very much there. I think they're looking at a second half of 26 demo mission. They're not going to rendezvous with the ISS on this demo mission, but they'll be able to. They're going to get a pretty good opportunity to prove out all of their capability, and you know, to some degree, if you build it, they will come. And so, showing all the capability that they've built out, they'll be able to find use cases within the Department of Defense without an issue.
I think so. And then, given the fact that it's been their own technology that they've been working on for a long time, it's poised well for this, especially since the cargo contract, even though it's worth so much, is for the ISS, which is getting decommissioned in the next few years, like 2030, I think is the new target date. So even if they manage to successfully demo this next year, they'd only have a few years to be pulling in money from those contracts. So I think regardless of whether they could have continued getting money from NASA, they would need to pivot to defense. So I don't know if them forming Sierra Defense in June was an anticipation of losing this contract, or if they were really seeing the opportunity for defense. Because the other spacecraft they're competing with, the Cygnus and the Dragon, they're not really meant to be space planes. And in a lot of ways, Sierra Space really over-designed for this competitive landscape, and it might end up paying off in the long term, since there's not very many space planes out there to compete with. Like one of the few domains that SpaceX is not a juggernaut in.
Well, Sierra, so the Dream Chaser's capabilities vastly outstrip those of the Northrop Grumman Cygnus or the SpaceX Dragonfly capsule. Like Sierra Space, the Dream Chaser is able to do so much more than either of those vehicles are able to do. But to your point, like they've all been running the same delivery. They've all been doing the same fundamental task here. So yeah, Sierra has over-designed for that, but again, they're going to be able to find some really valuable use cases on the defense side of things. So I think you're right that the decision to open up Sierra Defense is both influenced by the I'll say weak signals from NASA that NASA's budget and funding has continued to sort of deteriorate and been cut, and the fact that military spending, defense spending in the sector has been growing and is signaled to only grow further. So definitely both ends of that equation are contributing to the decision.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think they're going from one competitive landscape to another. I mean, competing at Cygnus and Dragon was one challenge, but now they're moving into the RPO sort of space tug industry and its applications to defense. So they're competing against some of the companies that are already in that space. I think they're also over-designed, mainly because this Dream Chaser is able to carry humans. And we'll have to see if that's a differentiating factor for their product. So we have companies like Catalyst Space that were just awarded a NASA contract this week to boost the Swift Observatory. So Swift Observatory has been up there, it's past its lifetime. It's going to deorbit because it's in low Earth orbit, but NASA's looking to boost it. And so they paid Catalyst to go up there and raise the orbit to keep Swift alive. This is an interesting application because we've kind of seen it before with Restore L, which actually got shuttered last year to renew Landsat's lifetime by raising that orbit and repairing it a bit. So it seems like they're trying this again with a new company and maybe trying to boost their capabilities to provide that as part of their toolbox. But you know that the Defense Department is looking at this this demonstration as well. Catalyst has been around since 2019, but just this year they acquired Automos Space, which is another space tug company. So it looks like they're trying to position themselves very well to be a sort of dynamic platform that can go to other spacecraft and boost them and resupply them and do these sort of performance.
It's interesting that we're already seeing consolidation in the space before there's been any real revenue realization in it. Typically, at the start of an industry's market, it's super fragmented. Everyone and their brother is doing their own thing, and as more and more money gets into the industry, as the market grows, as there's more money to be made in it, you start to see bigger players come in. You start to see somebody who started early there start to win out a little bit, and over time you see a little bit of consolidation to a more mature market space, where rather than hundreds of individual players, you'll see sort of maybe a few dozen players, or maybe just a handful of players, and they own 70% of the market share, something of that effect. But point being that typically happens, and you can follow that sort of that maturity line as far as consolidation in the market goes. You can follow that pretty proportional to the total market size and the total amount of revenue and contracts in that market. So as we spoke about earlier in the month, the space tug industry is definitely not in that level of maturity, and yet we're already seeing largely off the back of some of this anticipated military expenditure, some of this anticipated growth in defense spending. We're already seeing some consolidation, and we're seeing a lot of people, a lot of companies anticipating that type of revenue realization and growth, even though in the best case scenario, those revenues are still 2 to 3 years out. So it's interesting to see that play out in real time. But it's a great little sort of market maturity case that you can look at.
Yeah, and I wonder, I'd love to get your take on it, but it does seem that when your main customer is the Defense Department, you're encountering more of these large, there's fewer customers, but the contracts are much larger. So it's less support for a broad ecosystem of companies, and it really does force consolidation, which is what we see with these stalwart kind of defense companies like Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon. They acquire a bunch of small companies. They've been around forever. They're very large, and they just gobble up all these contracts. So I think, a lot of these venture-funded smaller companies are the ones that have to consolidate in order to be able to share those contracts. Whereas companies like Space that are well-funded and have been getting money for a while, they're able to pivot without having to sell off to another company.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the bigger picture is that the Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, like Boeing, like these companies were basically founded and sort of became big winners in or around World War II, right? So after World War II, from a defense capability, the U.S. was peerless. And so the public prioritization was not in innovating or growing capabilities or developing new technologies. It was in preventing wasteful spending. It was in preventing fraud, because we were a peerless military. Nobody else had a third or a fraction of the capability that we had. And so we have about 80 years of sort of military industrial policy that has largely funneled folks to these major prime contractors, and it's been a very slow process, because you got to go slow so that nobody can steal anything. Everything's got to be audited and triple checked and quadruple checked. So it's very much been optimized to reduce fraud and to increase sort of, I'll say, financial transparency amongst the relevant stakeholders. And so what we're seeing now is that ecosystem has changed. We still have a head start, sort of to your point. We're still ahead of the competition, so to speak, in a lot of different aspects in the space domain. And we're still more advanced in a lot of different military capabilities than many of our other would-be peers. But we're no longer head and shoulders above the rest of the competition. We're maybe a few inches taller. So there's much more peer-to-peer capability there. And the reason that other folks have been able to catch up is that their entire military development plan has been optimized for innovation, has been optimized to rapidly reduce that cycle time so that they're able to develop and acquire and progress. And so this is the entire purpose of the DIU. This is the entire purpose of the Skunk Works, SpaceWorks, AFWorks, of all of these different innovation programs. It's been 10 years, 15 years sort of in the making, getting the entirety of the defense industry to pivot and to find ways to be more innovative and more rapidly adaptable. And so we're seeing the same thing play out in the space domain awareness capacity, where we do have these sort of major prime contractors. There are these massive billions and billions of dollars worth of contracts that go out that have to be dispersed and have to be broken down and funneled in different ways. But there's a decided effort amongst the U.S. government and amongst the military to find more efficient ways of getting that funding to the people and companies who are capable of problem solving and providing the solutions that they need. So this was an inappropriately long-winded way for me to say that, yes, you're absolutely right. There is this systematic push amongst military spending towards these major conglomerates, towards this really, really concentrated, highly unfragmented market. And that's just sort of the way that we've been intentionally building things for the last 100 years. However, that is very much changing. There's a lot of tailwinds, a lot of push internally and externally for these pipelines for acquisition and innovation and product development and capability improvement to work more rapidly, to iterate, and to really be more entrepreneurial than not in the way that they're going about doing things. So lot of effort going towards increasing the amount of fragmentation, towards increasing the amount of innovation, and providing, dispersing that money and providing a lot more opportunities to solve some of these problems.
Yeah, and I think to your point of comparing this to World War II, like we've been hearing that we're in the second space race for a while. And following World War II is Cold War and the buildup of space capabilities between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. I feel like we're sort of seeing a new revival of that, in so much that we weren't quite in the space race yet. SpaceX with the Falcon 9 wasn't so much initiating a space race between launch companies. It was the starting gun for this new age of space capabilities. When Falcon 9 came online, it changed the whole game for space. It revolutionized our access to space. It democratized the ability for everybody, not just large nation states, to utilize that asset. And I think what we're seeing now is that opening of this new domain, the space domain, has brought the attention to a lot of the world. And so these companies are coming out of all this money being spent and thrown around, and we're really starting to see the competition heat up and a lot of money moving around. I mean, just within the past 2 weeks, like SpaceX is still obviously the leader. They spent $17 billion to take out, some of their competitors in the Starlink market. Now they've lost a competitor in the Dragon market, and they're still far ahead in the Falcon 9 launch market. But there are lots of potential competitors coming up. I mean, you look at a company like Avio, and they've got 350 million euro from Europe to develop their launch capabilities. They've been doing very well with the Vega C launch vehicle, but they're also supporting with the development of the Ariane 6 launch vehicle, which is the next generation vehicle that ESA is using. And they've even gotten some funding from Raytheon, if we're talking about large defense conglomerates, to build the Mark 104 solid booster motors for the missiles. This is largely coming out of the Ukraine war, where they need more and more missiles in order to fight back against Russia. but we've seen so many other use cases in Ukraine of space assets, not just rocket motors, but Starshield was very useful in the early days. Having battlefield comms has sort of highlighted the need for this proliferated war network. The involvement of a nuclear power in a large scale war has brought about this Golden Dome initiative and a lot of missile tracking and defense capabilities. So I think we are really seeing a parallel to what we saw back in the 60s, 70s in modern day, but just playing out a lot across a larger scale, across a more commercial landscape that is learning to partner with the defense industry. And the defense industry in kind is learning how to leverage that scrappy kind of startup mentality of this industry to develop these new capabilities.
Absolutely. I would add to sort of what you've been saying about that in two major ways here. One, I wholeheartedly agree with the comparison of sort of post-World War II to the Cold War and the initial space race. Wholeheartedly agree with that. And not to tease the audience here, but I think we're going to be releasing a deeper dive, a special episode where we go into some of the aspects of this new space race, of this new age, quote unquote, Cold War. And the trends of that are 100% sort of what we're seeing play out, and the need for more innovation and more capability as we've gone from the prioritization being financial accountability to military or technological capability. We're seeing that shift play out in real time. And there's a lot of different reasons as to why we still want to have a lot of different capabilities. I mean, to your point, SpaceX is the absolute leader in launch, and yet U.S. government is still trying to increase sort of, I'll say, launch resilience, getting more launch sites and more launch providers, just so that there's no single point of failure. And this is the case throughout the entirety of the value chain. This is the case throughout the entirety of the ecosystem, from supply chain through execution. One of the things that we're seeing with the Avio contract is that I believe this is the third contract, not for Avio, but the U.S. Navy has created similar contract vehicles, wanting to find a second source provider for the Mark 104 missile capability. They've I think it was Ursa.
Huh.
Gosh, I'm blanking on it. But they're
in Expo Systems.
Yeah, Ursa Major and Expo. That sounds right. I think that is correct. So Ursa Major and Expo were both previously sort of contracted for this capability. It doesn't look like those contracts wound up converting and leading to either of those startups serving as secondary providers, but the effort is there. And sort of to your point, the increased awareness and investment in defense, the defense sector is changing so rapidly. The smartest people in the world during World War II were not rocket scientists. The most valuable people were logistics. If you were the smartest person, you worked for the U.S. government in logistics. Point being that military conflict has always ultimately been a battle of economics. And so what we're seeing now play out in real time in Ukraine, and with the scrambling of NATO jets to intercept some Russian drones that flew into NATO airspace, we're seeing $50,000 drones demand a response that amounts to $10 million in scrambled aircraft. And just that very fundamental, that baseline level of economic arbitrage, of the aggressor being able to spend $50,000 to force the defender to spend $10 million, just, you know, 2 orders of magnitude more, that's what the majority of the innovation that we're seeing in the defense sector is trying to solve. Trying to solve that arbitrage effectively so that we can meet much more closer to dollar for dollar the needs of the situation. So we're seeing that play out across the defense sector. We're seeing that play out across space. Absolutely, one of the domains heavily influenced by the defense sector. And so the desire and ability to have redundancies and secondary suppliers for some of these launch and component providers is a huge component of that success story.
Yeah, and I think it goes to, you know, back to the US EU partnership. I mean, Raytheon is funding them. They gave them money last year to develop the capability to build these missile motors. And like you said, they succeeded where a couple other companies didn't, to actually develop that capability and have subsequently gotten contracts to build it. And I think that flows in well to European capability, because they've been building these rocket motors for launch vehicles, and they're able to convert it over to missiles fairly easily. And that's going to pay off long term if they start working on the components for the Aster 30 and the CAM air missiles. Those are European-based missiles, unlike Raytheon missiles, which are just sold through, you know, through the cooperation of U.S. And EU. But I think like a lot of what benefited Avio in this particular instance is their work has largely been on solid rocket boosters. The Vega C is a largely solid booster rocket. They have a single liquid stage. And their work on other rockets has been for solid boosters. Whereas companies like Ursa Major, I believe they work on, you know, liquid bipropellant rockets. So building up a solid booster capability is not as easy for them, nor does it really make sense for their business case. For the case of Avio, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think it works well in the ecosystem of what EU is trying to do and will benefit them long term. And I think that's what we're starting to see with launch vehicle providers, is a lot of focus on what they're very strong at instead of trying to compete at something that they're very good at.
Right.
And we're seeing similar, you know, progress with a company we don't hear much about. It's just GE Aerospace. I mean, we all know GE, but they don't often have any announcements in terms of like new technology. But just this last week, they were able to show off some new rotating detonation rocket engine technology, which we had talked about previously, but it's a pretty rare technology to showcase. It's been in development for decades, but there seems to be some great progress here with a RDR missile and an RDR ramjet hybrid plane. And this is getting to like hypersonic capabilities, which has also been, you know, huge in the military industry recently. For much the same reason of like having that reactive force and being able to strike without the chance of defense from the opponent. So I think seeing some of these companies focus on what they're really good at and build out advanced technology and kind of pushing the envelope on the overall capability of our, you know, aerospace defense capabilities seems to be heightening recently. So on the totally other side of the coin, and you're talking about like defense applications and space technology for military, there's actually some interesting commercial movement this week. Some that we haven't seen too much of in the past, but space habitats has kind of been a thing this week. You know, we've heard for a while that the ISS would become a commercial space station, or there would be some commercial space station to replace it in the low Earth orbit, but that hasn't really materialized over the decade or so it's been discussed, and the ISS is getting very close to being decommissioned. So it seems there's some companies that are stepping in to sort of fill that gap potentially. Axiom Space has been around for a while. They've been talking about this for a while. They've done a few on-orbit demos with the ISS, but it seems like they're still kind of working at this problem. Just this week, they awarded Redwire a contract for some of the ROSA arrays, which are the rollout solar arrays that they produce. It's a very volume efficient, mass efficient solar array solution. So it would be good for a large deployable structure like a commercial space station to use those kind of products. Similarly, Voyager and Vivace have partnered for Starlab, which is the new commercial space station. I hadn't heard much of these companies, but Voyager is a space solutions company, so partnering with Vivace to design this Starlab could be interesting. I'd be interested to hear your take on kind of the usefulness of commercial space stations around Earth orbit. Traditionally, the ISS, Tiangong, Mir, they've all been science research platforms. So it's not really clear what value they bring to a commercial industry or to a military industry.
Well, so a lot of the value of the ISS is more diplomatic than it is purely scientific. By which I mean, there's a multitude of different types of diplomatic power one can influence or leverage, and having the means or being the sole proprietor or provider of a particular space type of research or space service, that itself is really meaningful and influential. So think about how we got folks to the ISS. How did we get American astronauts to the International Space Station prior to SpaceX and their Dragon capsule? We had to work with Russia in order to do that. Russia was the only one who had the launch capability for doing so. And so they held a large amount of diplomatic power. Point being that typically for these things where there isn't necessarily an explicit business case for doing so, where it's not entirely clear how owning or having this service is going to wind up making you more money than it will cost you, there's quite often a huge amount of soft power that goes with that if it's a state-owned or a federally owned program. So that being said, the pure commercial space lab, Starlab station that's being proposed has a different set of that is a different value proposition than the Tianyong. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but then the Chinese CCP's space station, right? So it's much more valuable to China to have the state-owned space station and to have all of these other nations looking to China in order to conduct any and all of their space experimentation, because that's a huge source of soft power. So a company like Voyager or Vivace building out Starlab, or Vivace, I like Vivace more, but a company like Voyager and Vivace building out Starlab, their value prop is going to be different. Their bottom line is going to be different than that of the Tianyang space station. And so what I don't know is how are they going to wind up breaking even or making money off of this? Is the space station itself meant to be a lost lead item that they're going to wind up serving the space station as a refueling platform, as an on-orbit servicing platform? This station is going to be crewed, so they'll have people there to do that, and that's how they're going to make money. And so the station itself is more of a gas station or a mechanics shop in orbit. Is that sort of the value add that they're building towards? If it is a pure research station, most of these experiments that are being conducted are not well funded enough or expensive enough to where, or they're not well funded enough to where they'd be able to effectively fund the International Space Station or the Starlab space station themselves. So if Starlab is meant to be profitable based off the experiments that are being run on it, that's going to be a tough selling point, because so many of these experiments going up on the ISS are university funded, are small budgets, 50,000, maybe 100,000 in total budget, and they're trying to get up there basically for free. So it'll be different is what I'm saying. And so, if you're the the Chinese space station, or if you're the US space station or the Russian or European space station, what have you, you don't really care about the cost of maintaining or conducting. You don't really care about what the capital expense is. What you're much more interested in is the fact that you have all of these foreign nations who now need to deal with you and need to work with you in order to get their experiment on the space station.
Yeah.
So I'm super skeptical about the baseline of a commercial space station that's used exclusively for research. I think if Voyager and Vivace are building out a commercial space station, the value add has to be that there's a lot more going on than just pure scientific research. Scientific research could be a massive part of that. It can absolutely be one of the key things that they're trying to accomplish with the space station. But scientific research is not lucrative enough to warrant the construction of a multi-billion-dollar space station. There's just not enough money in it for it to be commercially viable.
I mean, it's a really interesting point, bringing it back to kind of the space tug ecosystem, where you need a central hub to do, like you said, refueling, and to do kind of coordination amongst these satellites. Because if you're able to remove kind of one of the key aspects of that ecosystem, which is that, once a space tug goes out and services another spacecraft, it's got to come back and refuel. It's got to have maintenance, like, who's fixing the robots. If you had somebody on orbit, some place where these satellites come back and get repaired and get fixed up, and kind of centralize it there. It's a really interesting use case. I mean, the fact that the Axiom CEO is the same person that's the executive chairman for Quantum Space, Cam Ghaffarian, that's another company we've seen make moves this week, where they bought out the hybrid propulsion unit from Phase 4 after the company got bought by Apex. So it almost seems like he might be seeing a correlation between the space tug kind of ecosystem that Quantum Space is targeting and the on-orbit commercial space station ecosystem that his other company, Axiom Space, is targeting. So maybe there is some interplay here that we're not seeing. Because similarly, Voyager, who's the one building Starlab, also acquired Bridgecom this week, which is an optical terminal company. So
I didn't know about the Bridgecom acquisition. That's big.
Yeah. But what does the commercial space station need an optical terminal company for? There might be some interplay there. The other thing Axiom had been talking about recently was on-orbit data centers. So if Voyager is seeing a similar potential, then an optical terminal can make sense. If you have a large commercial space station that contains a bunch of data servers, being able to beam that down through an optical terminal would be really useful.
There's already to push back on the orbital data centers briefly, there's already a small handful of companies that have a better value add than building an international space station not an international space station, but building a space habitat in order to house data centers of just building satellites themselves that passively function as data centers. So I'd push back on that initial idea. However, the point that you're very much hitting on is the fact that this commercial space station is much more likely going to look like a space infrastructure project than it is a space research center project.
Yeah.
And so because the infrastructure is so necessary for future advancement in the industry, that we're going to need to find a way as an industry to make that infrastructure profitable enough for the folks who build it to where they are incentivized to build it. Here domestically, here terrestrially, infrastructure is just always a huge expense, right? Nobody makes money off of it. The toll roads are sort of the closest thing you can get to somebody sort of trying to make money off of what amounts to just a really big expenditure for a public service or a public good. And so, ground stations or optical terminal relays, makes sense if you would want to turn the station into effectively a giant relay terminal, being able to communicate with an entire fleet of tugs or other service vehicles, or to serve as a major hub in any capacity. All of that makes sense, and I can see the commercial side of it. But I think that there's a lot of there's a lot of simultaneous problems that need to be solved in order to make that viable.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of the preliminary the preparation for space infrastructure. A lot of it's been poised for Starship to start working. I think that will be the big inciting factor for us to become interplanetary and have more presence in space at larger scale. But there's plenty of companies that have been working on this, and it seems like some of these efforts are, starting to show some progress. And there's some other companies like StarPath that have been talking recently about Martian and lunar habitats and the need for cheaper solar arrays. They've claimed they've reduced their solar panel cost by 90% through automation and the production capacity. And their reasoning for pursuing that so hardly is that in order to build large scale power for these habitats in space, the cost for solar panels needs to come down drastically. I mean, it can go up to like $250 per watt for space applications. They're targeting $12 per watt. So I think that gives that sort of improvement will benefit short-term or space assets, but long-term it's really meant to help build out these space ecosystems. And Firefly is also seeing some progress based on old activity they've done, but successfully. They've won another $10 million contract from NASA for another Blue Ghost mission after the successful lunar landing they had last time, which, there's been a few attempts recently that have not gone so well. So it's great to see Firefly getting some traction there, because the lunar lander is really key for us to kind of close that bridge from one planet to another. On top of that, NASA is opening the 2026 Human Lander Challenge for Life Support Systems challenge to colleges to build out new technology. So it's good to see an emphasis from NASA to continue developing some of these capabilities. It'll allow college students to submit system designs for noise suppression and control, sensor reduction and health monitoring systems, potable water dispensers, and fluid transfer between surface assets on the Moon and Mars. So we're kind of seeing the sort of things that NASA sees a gap in and wants focused development for. So you want to run us through some of the big business moves this week?
Yeah. Run through some of the highlights that we saw. Big one. Well, I guess there's sort of two co-headliners here, but one of whom is Rocket Lab selling off $750 million in common stock. Unclear initially as to whether this is an intended liquidation event for existing stockholders or whether this is an issuance of new stock. But the former would indicate that Rocket Lab isn't publicly traded, I don't believe.
It is.
It is publicly traded? Okay, great. So then them selling $750 billion in common stock would indicate that they're issuing new shares. And so the board would have approved that. They'd be issuing new shares. Theoretically, the individual share stock price would potentially dip a little bit, but the issuance of new shares is a big fundraising opportunity. So very exciting news on their behalf. I'm curious as to sort of what their intended use of the funds will wind up being. And the second sort of major headliner is the major updates out of Kuiper and Starlink. Kuiper launched 27 satellites on the Atlas V rocket, and then 26 Starlink satellites went up on Falcon 9 the next day.
28.
Kuiper,
No, same day.
On the same day. So
Same
27,
day.
and then they got one up with the SpaceX launch of 28 later that day.
One additional satellite over Kuiper. Not that they need it. They have so many more satellites in order. I think Starlink has like tens of thousands, and Kuiper's only at like 200 now.
Yeah,
but in the endless pissing match between Bezos and Musk,
it's still floating.
It's still floating.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. So Kuiper is scheduled to launch 30 next on a Falcon 9. I believe that's scheduled for next month. But in addition to that, Aerospace Lab raised 37.5 million euros. They're a European space solutions company planning on developing some additional capabilities with that, and a couple of additional smaller raises that occurred throughout the week that probably aren't as big news as the other three, but we also had some impressive tech breakthroughs that I'd love to hear about.
Well, one of those raises that you mentioned is Space with the 2.3 million euro pre-seed round. What I found interesting about that company is that that money is to develop an air-breathing VLEO capability, which is a very rare technology. I believe the only one flying with that right now is the GOES satellite. It is an old, it's a pretty old European satellite that does gravity wave monitoring, and it's actually able to blend fuel with air and generate power thrust that way. But Kratos is claiming that they have a thruster that requires no fuel, so it could fly just off air and solar panel to generate plasma.
Yeah, we've looked at a similar company based out of the U.S. here that is solving that same problem. I would assume in a similar way. There's only so many ways to use solar energy and VLEO atmosphere to generate plasma. So it looks like Kratos is solving a similar problem to some of these domestic companies.
Yeah,
but
it's one of those techs, kind of like the RDRE, where it's been in development by high tech agencies like DARPA for a long time. But it would be really cool to see it become more prevalent. Like I said, it's been used before, so it's not like this is the first time, but using it in an application that's starting to become more popular, like VLEO, where the imaging refresh rate is a lot higher. And there's a bunch of other benefits, like not being in a busy orbit, allows you to take pictures at a much higher refresh rate. It's harder to keep it in orbit, but if this technology works, it kind of counters that downside. So really hoping that pre-seed money goes a long way for them developing a platform that works and help build up this nascent ecosystem. In other news, JAXA's Akatsuki satellite just finished its Venus mission. It was a Venus probe used to measure Venus atmosphere and understand it more fully. It's been operating for over like 10 years. So it's past its lifetime. They lost comms with it recently and have decided to let it finish out its mission. So huge success there. There's a big launch this week for NASA and partnered agencies. I believe Berkeley Space Systems Labs was one of the main partners on the SWFO-L1, the Carruthers, and the IMAP satellite. These are a trio of satellites going to the Lagrange point 1, so that gravity balance between the Earth and the Sun, where we've had a few weather satellites parked before. But primarily it's a very useful orbit for constant monitoring of the Earth because nothing gets in the way of your images. It's a bit further out, so the instruments have to be more tuned for that. But a lot of these instruments are pointed towards the sun. They're all meant to gather data on solar storms, space weather, better understand the impact of radiation from the sun and its impact on space assets and Earth assets, how it affects our spacecraft, and hopefully in long term, how to better defend against some of these events, which again ties back to this SDA standpoint. There's a lot of interest in figuring out how to better defend our space assets. China has also had some awesome tech breakthrough with the Peking University demoing a new laser communications platform off their GEO satellite. They were able to get a gigabit per second down from a GEO satellite to the ground, which is one of the furthest distances to transmit data through a laser terminal. You have lots of problems there, primarily having to do with pointing, although you have the same kind of atmosphere attenuation and distortion that you have with other demonstrations we've seen recently from LEO to Earth, just at a greater distance. So it's very impressive that they're able to achieve this. It was a very high power laser. A gigabit per second is an amazing data rate. And if you're able to do that between a platform that's consistently sitting overhead and the ground, that's an amazing capability to have. So hopefully there's some progress there, some commercialization there, that it becomes part of this kind of global communications network that we've been hitting on now for the past couple of weeks. And in the same vein, United Airlines just got FAA clearance to fly Starlink terminals. So much in the same vein that we saw the Kepler communications demo between the satellite and the airplane. We're starting to see that commercialized, at least for Starlink, where airplanes are able to be in contact consistently with these space networks of communications. So hopefully you'll have even better Wi-Fi on your flights with United soon. Thank you for joining us this week on the Space Times podcast. We're glad you joined our little corner of the universe to discuss all the exciting times happening in space. Until next week, I've been Harrison Lambert, here with Paul Mayer, signing off for now.